It's James from the Queer Review here. Also have my banana. I don't usually have a prop, but I just saw that on my way in to to do the interview. Well, congratulations, Todd, on the film. It's such a beautiful flow to this film, mesmerizing.
Thank you, James.
And it kind of felt to me like the opening section of the film, or the beginning section, was almost like musical notes or instruments tuning to come together to form a piece of music or to form the band. And I wondered why you wanted to devote so much time to the origins, these key figures, their influences, and also the cultural context of the time that the band came together in.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's definitely, as you state, was an intention from the very beginning. And it was really about trying to locate what the band meant, what the sound meant, why and how it was, possibly like to have heard it at the time. And, and and to understand that all bands, and particularly this band, are kind of a collision of accidental forces that come together, and that what they end up creating is still more than the sum of those parts. But I wanted to really put you in that, the whole film, I think, is an attempt to put the audience as much as possible in the time and place of the 1960s and this incredibly unique sort of artistic culture and experimental spirit that was driving not just music but art and film and so many of the converging, creative forces that were around this band.
And could you talk a little bit about kind of the queerness of the Velvet Underground in the way that it was pushing against the heteronormative? And I know we use the word queer probably slightly differently to the 60s context, but I think you know
Yeah,
what I'm getting at. Yeah.
exactly. I struggle with finding the words that feel historically precise, because we will say queer and we'll know what we mean, but it is a sort of revisionist term, heteronormative, which is really, I think, accurate to describe what they were pushing against without having that term or that kind of concept in place, which almost makes it even more impressive because these were not ideas. I mean, these ideas came out of the culture that they forged. Um, but I think so much of it was an evolution away from the kind of highly machismo defined sort of abstract expressionist culture of the 50s in New York City, and this interesting transition in art making that moved from those guys who were making amazing work that influenced an entire generation, and then moved into people like Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, who were gay artists, but who weren't naming it as such. They were still their work was different. It was pulling from detritus and trash and sort of emblems of cultural language and putting them into art, and that was radical. But Andy Warhol took it further, and I love the story where Andy asked his friend, he loved Rauschenberg, he loved Jasper Johns, and he was like, why don't those guys talk to me at parties? And his friend said, Andy, you're too swish. You're too overt. And it embarrasses them from where they stand. And it just showed that we were moving forward. And Andy Warhol was moving forward even before he knew what he was doing. And it was changing what was possible and what was the new set of norms within this 60s culture that would really take root at the factory. But what's so cool is, to me, the band, these are people from all over the place, from John Cale from Wales and Nico from Germany and Lou Reed and Sterling and Mo from Long Island. But somehow got they got the same message. They spoke a similar language. And maybe it wasn't until they landed in Los Angeles, as you see in my film, that they were able to say, yeah, this is this is our language, and we're united at the core, and it's a queer language, and even if we're not all gay people, the language is defined by a new way of seeing the world.
Yeah, and in terms of being sort of literally queer, I guess, or gay, when it comes to Lou Reed, it's very interesting that the poetry that you touch on, and you have someone saying how sort of shocking they found that because it's sort of gay cruising and bathroom sex and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And he was performing at the Hayloft at a gay place, and this is all obviously pre-Stonewall. It's illegal to be gay, and it's classified as a mental illness. And kind of, it's quite brave and revolutionary to say you're gay at that time. And how important was it that you explore that with the film and to make sure that you incorporate Lou's sexuality in the film?
It was essential. It was not. It was that it was part of an ethos and an ideology, but it was also being practiced literally in Lou Reed's life and in the people of the fact who he hung out with at the factory. He would literally, like, it's so remarkable to me. Even as a teenager, he'd he'd sort of rebel at home by mincing around the room and acting swish to his father. Like that level, this is the 50s in the suburbs of New York. And you're thinking, wow, man, that level of confidence. And yes, it was provocative. Lou Reed liked to make people uncomfortable. He liked to take his straight friends to the hayloft. He liked to take his girlfriend to the hayloft, and say, this is what I do. This is who I am, and I want to see you engage in this world too. He was provocative. There was a hostility there. There was an antagonism at times, but there was also an incredible courage about being different that defined him and continued to define him even when he wasn't practicing his gay, relationships later in his life.
And there's a really beautiful queer sequence in the film during, I think, Venus in Furs is playing, and we
Mm,
get to see a bit of Kenneth Anger's Scorpio Rising. And could you
yeah.
give me a bit of an insight into, piecing that together and what it incorporates and what it says in the film, I guess?
I mean, look, Venus and Furs is about sadomasochism, and Sakar Masak's book that sort of where the term masochism comes from. So it was about the emblems of the femme fatale, I mean, the dominatrix culture and sadomasochistic practice in sexual scenarios and imagination. And so I wanted the fetishism of the images from films that were from that time to be linking to that. Mary Warrenoff and Gerard Malanga would do the whip dance on stage in leather and would play out these sort of sadomasochistic roles on stage with the Velvet Underground. The other film playing is Christmas on Earth, Barbara Rubin's film that literally shows two couples engaged in explicit sex, and one of them are two men, and one of those men is Gerard, with anal intercourse in the film, but it's beautifully like a frame embossed within another frame within it, and sort of blown out in colors with an optical printer. It's a gorgeous and radical piece of overt sexual content in experimental film. And I wanted both of those films to sort of be interwoven during that sequence.
Well, there's so many points where I want to sort of, I don't know, rewatch rewatch the sequences. Um, I love the visual language of the film, and particularly the use of split screen, very extensive use of split screen. I think at one point we have 12 images when Jonas Mekas is speaking.
Yeah.
Could you just give me an insight into deciding on that, and also, well, it felt to me that it sort of reflected the theme of so many different things going on at once, and the sort of poetry and music and film, and the lines being blurred, I guess.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. I think that was a way of visualizing the cacophony of creative practice that was going on in the curiosity of artists from one medium with artists from another medium and trying to break down those boundaries. The idea of the split screen really started in the film as an homage to Chelsea Girls, which is Andy Warhol's probably most successful commercially successful avant-garde film from the 60s, from 1967, which is a dual projector movie with two screens going on at once. But from that point on, Andy kept experimenting with multiple images side by side. And of course, with the exploding plastic inevitable shows of the Velvet Underground, he was projecting multiple projectors onto the band on stage with Andy Warhol films on top of each other, and strobe lights and gelled color gels and mirror ball, stuff which hadn't really been used since the 1920s in musical venues like that, with the whip dancing going on. So if there was a literal space where all of these elements of the arts were really colliding, it was at those very shows.
And how kind of early on did you decide that you were kind of lead with the images in a way? Because I mean, some documentaries, the images are sort of there because there needs to be something on screen, but obviously in this case, they're integral to the storytelling. So along
Yeah,
with the music and the images, and it's not that the interviews are secondary, but sometimes there is an imbalance, I guess, isn't there, with some documentaries where it almost kind of feels like.
Sure.
absolutely. No, I appreciate the question because it was definitely the motivation from the start, was to try to let the music and the images lead your experience in the film. That said, the interviews that we collected for the film were so special and so extraordinary. So it was a constant balancing act between getting the narrative in there, but making it sort of feel like the audience was kind of intuiting it, and that it wasn't literally the words leading the experience, but it was the images and music leading the experience. And you were sort of hearing the story as you were seeing it. And that hopefully that would be a way to kind of music that finally has entered the canon, the Velvet Underground. It took a long time, but it's hard for that music to be heard afresh and to kind of identify, okay, what was it exactly that was radical about this music? What are we hearing that no one had heard before at the time? And so this was also a way we sort of hope to get inside that culture and hear the music freshly.
Yes, almost sort of defamiliarize us with it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Get the audience a little lost. I was watching the film after the Cannes premiere. I watched it at Telluride, and I was watching that first hour and thinking, oh wow, I bet people are watching this movie and sort of forgetting what movie they're watching. Because it takes a while to get to the first Velvet song with a Lou Reed vocal. And I'm like, that's cool. That's exactly what we want.
That was my
Is to
experience
sort
too.
of
I'm like,
lose yourself.
is it gonna? This is the Velvet Underground, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And tell me a little bit about your collaboration with your two editors
Mm.
and working, with Adam and Alfonso and working through COVID with them.
Well, it was just an amazing sort of survival project to have during what none of us saw coming, obviously. We had shot the interviews in 2018, and then Fonzie and I went off to do my last feature film, Dark Waters. Adam had, by this point, my partner Brian O'Keefe, who is one of the archive producers on the film, had sort of curated the list of avant-garde films, and we had gotten temp versions of most of those films, put them into the Avid, so Adam could really begin building the sort of foundation of this film, while Fonzie and I were off on the other project. Fonzie and I were able to come back by the end of 2019 and join Adam. And Fonzie and I were in Los Angeles. Adam was in Brooklyn, and then COVID hit, and Fonzie and I had been in the same room since the beginning of the year, so we were basically exposed to each other. So we were just in quarantine with this film, which was, yeah, it was like a gift to have this project to take us through those times.
Someone just broke in.
They're two of my incredible producing partners on this movie. Motto Films, Motto Pictures.
Yeah, well, it was an I'm glad you told us because it was an intriguing
moment.
reaction.
It's like a Velvet Underground
film when the police break in Symphony of Sound while they're performing in the factory.
No, I think the kind of division that people like to make, or the distinction between, narrative film and non-fiction film and documentaries can be a bit arbitrary at times. But I just wondered whether there was something that you maybe took from your other films that have had music at the center to making the Velvet Underground.
I think it's really just trying to always remember that this is a visual medium we're working in. And so whatever the topic, whatever the subject matter, and particularly when it's musical artists as the subject matter of a film, like my Velvet Goldmine film about the glam rock era, or I'm Not There about Dylan, or even Karen Carpenter, the film Superstar. It's how to find the visual language and the narrative form that best serves what that artist was doing musically, and try to find a counterpoint to it in a visual context. And with this, it was just, it was because of these films that were this culture of the avant-garde that this band had such a uniquely close relationship to and came out of in such an intrinsic way. Like, what other band can you say that about? It's a remarkable thing. So again, it was about how to really use those films, which were kind of at our disposal. I felt almost like there was something illicit about using them to the degree that we did. Like I was like a kid with with his hand in the cookie jar, because we use them without citing them as they unfold. All the films, of course, are cited at the end of the doc, and that takes a while to get through that list because it's a formidable list of films and filmmakers. But I wanted you to be able to freely enter that world without necessarily it being a academic experience.
So one final question for you, Todd, and it's for your favorite piece of LGBTQ plus culture, whether that be a book or a TV series, a film, a play, or you could pick a person who identifies as LGBTQ plus, someone or something that's had an impact on you, resonated with you over the years, and why.
That's too broad. It's too broad. I feel like it's important to mention Jean Genet, who's I sort of used as an inspiration for my first feature film, Poison. This was very much coming out of the AIDS epidemic, that film. But Genet is a reminder, I think, and it's important, I think, in today's LGBTQ plus culture that there was not necessarily in the sort of political sense, but a militancy about queer expression, gay expression in art and literature that defined itself adamantly outside the norm and the mainstream. And Genet did that with, exquisite, heart-rending, poetic language and a keen sense of looking at the culture from a critical view and talking about African American experience and queer experience and the criminal underworld. But he wanted homosexuality to be criminal. He embraced that sense of it being corrosive and something that would question the status quo all the time. And that helped me at that particular time in my life to look at what was happening in HIV and AIDS. But I think it's an important thing to always go back to and remember.
Well, Todd Haynes, thanks very much. Congratulations on the Velvet Underground.
Thank you, James.
Great to
Great
talk
to
to you
talk.
again.